Hey there, everyone. I had a lot of fun with the short episode from last week and spent the better part of 2 days planning the next set of episodes. It feels weird every time I say this, but I'm actually super excited for what may come in this next set of episodes. The content speaks for itself. I don't have to hype it, but I will anyway. Last time, we saw the final conclusion of the various missions that were needed to wrap up. Now, loose ends are tightened. We just have the rest of the chunin exams to play out, and I can get started on the next big chapter of this rewrite. Because my episodes are pretty long most of the time, and I've taken more breaks than normal lately. It definitely feels like the story has slowed down on my end some. I distinctly remember at Christmas thinking that I'd be done the next big part by March. And here I am, not even there yet. Don't mistake that for regret or anything so negative, it's just an observation. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm not going to speed up or slow down this rewrite just for the sake of finishing it sooner or with X amount of chapters. And frankly, I just cannot wait for the end of this chapter to talk to you all again. There's a lot of experimental writing that I get into with this series. Conceptual styles that I've always thought about but never done, and this is sort of a premium work area to try all of that out so that I can get instant feedback from like 1,000 people. For example, everyone knows about first and third person perspectives, but what about that rarely talked about second person perspective? And yes, that is a thing. Or what about omnipresent perspective? In small parts, I've tried all of these out, as well as genres in certain areas. Can I excite you, or scare you, or make you feel down? That's right, I'm like that lizard dude from Spider-Man making a weather control device that actually just controls emotions. You know the one I'm talking about. In all seriousness, this kind of thing is extremely beneficial to rounding out my skill set as a writer, so if you would please provide feedback for the shifts that I make in this chapter's narrative, that would be fantastic. Let's get into it. Checking the time, Ino shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe they're still fighting," she exclaimed loudly. Her and each of the other genin had been partitioned off this time, though they could still hear each other if they spoke loud enough. They stood at the same ledge as last time, only there was now manufactured walls that gave each of them a private cubby. And it was within each cubby that they were provided a notepad. Perhaps it was another new test for these chunin exams, but they were asked to write down every single mistake each combatant made in every single fight. Of course, someone like Neji or Hinata would have an advantage, Ino thought, but she found this current fight quite easy to follow. That said, she thought she would have spotted an error in Hanabi's side of things at least once, yet the fight droned on, and she remained flawless in execution. It made the news especially surprising that Konohamaru remained competitive in the fight, because on his side of things, Ino spotted, so many mistakes. "I know!" Kiba shouted from somewhere nearby. Ino felt like his cubby was right beside her own. "It's been 15 minutes! "Hanabi will not crack," Neji claimed confidently, and Ino could hear his smile through his proud words. She didn't want to vote against Hanabi simply because Neji was a prick, so she strived to keep her emotions apart. "That Sarutobi brat is at his wit's end. His chakra network has run its course." Imagine if he fought flawlessly too, Choji pondered thoughtfully. If he can survive this long with all his flaws, he'd definitely destroy her had he had perfect form. Would he now? Neji challenged. Hanabi's clearly reserving strength for her future matchups. "But she should not," Rockley argued. "It can appear as a sign of weakness to have mercy for your enemy. The real judges of this fight might dock her points if she tries to delay a fight because she thinks she will win now." "Still," Hinata muttered, "this fight is so much better than any of our matches the first time we were in here." "Hear that?" Ino asked, looking at the crowd above. Stone silence. Everyone's riveted. And so the two young genin continued their battle for supremacy as their whole world watched every move. Konohamaru had taken some hits, but remarkably, Hanabi had not yet used the gentle fist against him. He wondered why, because he knew she had the ability to. Hanabi, as of yet, remained unharmed, but remarkably, Konohamaru had not used any of his fabled Sarutobi jutsu against her. She wondered why, because she knew he could impress the crowd with it. If Konohamaru was known for anything, it was being an attention seeker. Why did he still hold back? The organizers had planted more trees and shrubbery on the field this time, and these two used their cover effectively without relying on cheap tricks to gain an easy upper hand over the other. They both honestly faced each other down and sought a proper fight. "What's it like?" Konohamaru asked between heavy breaths. "To have your big sister and cousin watching us so closely." "Encouraging," Hanabi answered with a smile. "They were away for a long time, and I finally get to show them how far I've come in their absence." "That must have been a heavy burden," Konohamaru acknowledged, finding his breath and straightening for another bout. "Show them then." "Gladly," Hanabi answered, appearing in his right flank as if lightning had become a shadow invisible to the eye. Not a single action was wasted, as Hanabi struck Konohamaru beneath the arm, between ribs at an especially difficult-to-reach chakra point. The force of her strike was enough to lift Konohamaru from his feet and launch him 20 more. Landing in a crumple on the ground, Konohamaru's fall was the first in 15 minutes to indicate a swing to the fight at long last, in Hanabi's clear favor. She stood with family on all sides, looking down upon her. It was a heavy burden, but it was also uplifting to know she had all this support, no matter who it was she went to. But Konohamaru was alone now. His parents were gone due to warring. His grandpa died before he was even born, and even his uncle Asuma had left the village. He was currently the next in line for clan leadership, as Hanabi had once been, when her sister and cousin were MIA. He thought she would see him eye to eye, fight the same mental battles that he had. Maybe it was the Sarutobi clan that was cursed. Maybe, like all those that fell before him, Konohamaru didn't have what it took to win. "That was a good hit," Konohamaru muttered, too quiet for Hanabi to hear. He tried to lift himself up, but the entire right side of his body had gone numb. He wanted to show Lord Forth that he had what it took to replace him as the 5th Hokage, but now that dream may as well have been dead. "Konohamaru!" a voice shouted from overhead, piercing straight through all other distracting noises. Leaning over from the signing seats that were currently empty, he saw a familiar face. Uncle Asuma?" Konohamaru stuttered, confused by his sudden presence. "You've got so much more to show, Konohamaru!" Asuma shouted. "Never give up!" Slamming his numb fist into the ground, Konohamaru's eyes lit with fire as he sprung to his feet. If Hanabi wanted to make his body numb, then he would fight numb. Tears blurred his vision, and Konohamaru laughed victoriously. "Uncle Asuma!" he shouted happily, locking eyes with Hanabi. "I finally get to show him how far I've come in his absence." The desert heat had not reached its peak, but the air was already thick with warmth, the kind that clung to the skin and settled deep in the lungs. Yet, this was the normal. Those who lived here were resistant to the curse of heat, had adapted to the scorching sands. This was just another day for them. Sunagakure stirred to life beneath a pale sky, its people moving with the unhurried rhythm of a village accustomed to the sun's relentless rule. The air was still in the streets, even as more and more people left their homes for the day of work ahead of them. Children too young for school were already springing out the door to perform chores for their parents. A pair of shinobi patrolled the winding streets, their tan cloaks lifting in the occasional breeze as the world finally began to wake. With the ceaseless flow and jostling in the streets, the citizens practically churned up their own wind as they filed in rows and columns through the skinny alleys. They walked in synchronized steps, their gazes sweeping across the vendors setting up their morning stalls. Some prepared fruits or vegetables, while others prepared fish ready to serve. There was no town square that centralized these stalls. Rather, they peppered every street in the village. Food was always available to purchase nearby. "Saw a pickpocket near the west gate yesterday," one of them said. "Kid couldn't have been older than 7 either." "That young?" the other replied without much inflection. "Did you stop him?" "Gave him a good scare. Didn't see him after that." They turned a corner, continuing on with their morning patrol. Another pair of guards approached from the opposite direction. The two pairs patrolled inverted paths to each other and often crossed paths. The 4 men exchanged nods, but none of them slowed their steps. They were much too familiar with each other to do that every single time. Down another street, a shopkeeper haggled over the price of imported silk with a merchant from the land of rivers. He laid a strip of cloth across his arm and shifted in place so that the sun's natural light could do the selling for him as it danced across the intricate patterns woven within the fabric. "Your stock is thinner than last time," the shopkeeper grumbled, rolling the fabric between his fingers. "Supply issues," the merchant shrugged. "Things have been strange at the border lately." "Strange? How?" "Just quieter." The conversation drifted elsewhere. A nearby prospective customer swapped back and forth between 2 spools of thread, over and over and over and over. The merchant, caught up in conversation, did not stop to aid the struggling customer as they stared perhaps in muted confusion at the spools. Across the street, a shinobi leaned against a stone wall, staring at nothing in particular. Perhaps he was lost in thought. Perhaps there was an upcoming mission occupying his thoughts. The stresses in Suna had never been particularly great for its shinobi. He had not blinked in some time. At the village center, the Kage building loomed, its sandstone walls shimmering in the morning light. The spherical shape that made up its upper levels stood as an unmissable monument in the village and served as one of Suna's oldest structures. That it stood the test of time was nothing but growing pride for its citizens. Inside its base, a handful of advisors debated logistics. "The festival is still scheduled for the end of the month," one of them announced. "Funding has been secured, though the merchant quarter is requesting additional security." The woman looked up from her notes to make sure the others were paying attention. Fine," another waved dismissively and let her continue to completion of her notes. "What of the perimeter check from last night?" "Standard patrols, no unusual activity." A few of them nodded, pleased by the routine report. Other than Lord Gara, there were very few happenings within the village that were out of the ordinary. This morning routine was like clockwork to most of the political officials and military officers in Suna. For some, it had grown quite boring. None of them seemed to notice that one of their own had yet to speak a word, and stood in stoic silence to all their shared words. Perhaps for some, this rigmarole had finally reached a point of monotony. Beyond the main chamber, in the hallway, the conversation was far less civil. "You're obsessed with this Kankuro?" Tamari snapped, her voice low but sharp. "You think you're entitled to Baki's position because why? You were his student? You are the son of the former Kazekage? That's not how leadership works. Then how has Gara gotten to where he has? That's without mentioning that idiot Rokuji. You think he's that much better than me?" Kankuro shot back. "He makes decisions like he's playing a damn board game. He's going to get people killed, Tamari." Tamari exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I know, but you're acting like this is all about you, not the village." Kankuro scoffed but said nothing, turning to enraged pacing. There was not much he or she could do in this instance other than rant and complain at one another. Inside a private chamber, another argument unfolded. The peaceful streets down below, with its rhythm and patterns unbroken even on the eve of this day, were a stark contrast to what occurred within their Kage building. "You need to focus on stability," Ebizo said, his voice patient but firm. "Rokuji is young, but he has command experience. He needs time to grow into the role." "Time isn't something we can afford," Gara said coolly. He stood near the window, arms crossed, his gaze on the citizenry below. A leader who hesitates is worse than one who makes mistakes. Rokuji makes both. And what would you propose? Chiyo asked, watching him carefully. Gara was silent for a long moment. Someone more capable. Someone with foresight. Rokuji bristled. I am right here. You could address me directly. Gara turned his head just enough to glance at him. Would you even listen if I did? Rokuji's hands clenched. You're not Kazekage. You don't get to decide, and you won't for a very long time with that impudent attitude. A heavy silence settled in the room. Rokuji was Baki's replacement as the commander of the village's Jonin. He was only a few years older than Tamari and Kankuro and had seen just as many missions as they. However, he had never been exposed to such heavy responsibilities as those that could decide the future of the village before. Kankuro thought he was brash from day one and wanted the role himself. And while the five of them said their piece, Gara continued gazing outside. From outside the window, the soft rhythmic sound of marching footsteps barely got through the walls. Gara leaned closer to the window to look further below. A squad of guards passed below, moving with seamless synchronization. Gara's lip quivered slightly, almost into a smile. Their movement reflected one of professionalism and the proud payoff of endless training. Unfortunately, though, Gara knew that the ability to walk in step with others wasn't enough to intimidate their enemies in the world. Gara's eyes flicked back to them for just a second. Something about their movement actually felt a little off. He cursed that they marched beyond his range of vision to watch, but before he could dwell on it, Chiyo's voice called his attention back to the discussion. The illusion of normalcy held. Gara left the chamber with measured steps, his thoughts clouded by the lingering tension of the discussion. Rokuji was unusually stubborn, and it ground against everyone's patience. Even still, Lady Chiyo insisted that the village needed young blood beyond the Sand siblings to start populating its ranks. She promised that Rokuji was born of the storm. As he moved through the corridors of the Kage building, the usual hum of activity surrounded him, advisors exchanging reports, messengers hurrying between rooms, shinobi standing at their posts. It wasn't even noon yet, and still the building was alive on every floor. In other words, everything was normal. Gara had spent much of his childhood secluded from everyone. They were terrified that he might literally kill them, but between his late father and now Lady Chiyo, he was finally getting the education he needed to rise himself to a respectful stature. Where he was simply seen as a mindless monster to most before, Lady Chiyo told him that he was beginning to understand and portray elements of being born of the storm. Sunagakure as a village existed despite the harsh desert storms. Its citizens and its construction weren't of luck, but of will to survive. Theirs was a strength through hardship. Konoha may have had its will of fire, but Sunagakure had those who were born of the storm. Gara wondered why his hardships weren't greater than everyone else's, and it took time for Chiyo to make him understand that they all struggle through hardships together. That's what makes them a village. Since Ino left, everything had certainly returned to a level of normalcy Gara wasn't quite used to. Yet, something pressed against the edge of his awareness, an irritation he could not yet name. Something he had seen earlier? Or heard? He couldn't be sure. His personal guards flanked him as he walked, their presence a silent fixture of his daily life. Indeed, of all the denizens in the village, Gara did not need guards, but these were, of course, special. Unlike the weak seal used on Naruto Uzumaki, the Sand were very proud of their own. It could only be broken if Gara lapsed and opened it himself. These guards kept him from relapsing. Gara had long since learned to tune them out, but today they felt different. Was it the way they moved, or how their footfalls aligned so perfectly? The precise rhythm of their breathing? It was just all too uniform, too controlled. Gara glanced over his shoulder at one of them. He stopped walking. The guard stopped exactly at the same time. Shukaku grumbled irritation, its creeping voice ever an earsore for Gaara. But sometimes, like just now, their thoughts exactly aligned. This was either a stupid prank, or possibly his guards were replaced with two that were far more competent. Gaara did not turn to face them, but his voice was calm when he spoke. "Stand at ease." The guards remained rigid. At the very least, they were different from the usual rabble. Perhaps they were terrified of him? It was subtle, but they did not shift in the way trained shinobi normally would. There was no natural weight redistribution, no casual loosening of posture. They simply waited. If possible, it actually made Gaara uncomfortable how uniform they were being. He wondered if this feeling was what others experienced when facing him. A test, then. Gaara continued forward, this time slowing his pace irregularly, subtly altering his stride. Lady Chiyo told him force was not always the answer. He needed to use his head to solve some of the problems of the world. At the very least, people wouldn't run at the sight of him so easily. The guards adjusted without hesitation, maintaining perfect synchronization. Gaara felt a subtle shift in his own unconscious chakra activation as a will to act on this unnatural reaction surged into him. His sand coiled loosely around his gourd, trembling ever so slightly, an instinctive response to danger. His gaze flicked toward the nearest reflective surface, a window catching the glare of the sun. In the warped glass, he saw their faces. No tension in their jaws, no flicker of life in their eyes. Just static expressions, waiting. Gaara's brow furrowed as he attempted to solve this puzzle without moving. He knew brash action may awaken the beast within, and then he might be unable to stop himself. He wondered why their appearance and activity suddenly felt so familiar. Gaara felt his pulse quicken, though his face remained impassive. He had not ordered them to follow, and yet they were. Gaara's fingers twitched, instinctively reaching for his sand. His guards were watching him, their movements stiff yet eerily deft. Was he just on edge today after the stressful meetings? Were they always like this? He had begun the journey to his own office and was in the home stretch. Something about the stillness of the hallway, the way the walls seemed to close in, the oppressive silence, made the air feel heavy. He turned on his heel suddenly, facing them. "Who gave you your orders?" he asked, his voice sharp, testing. Neither guard moved an inch. A pause. Too long. Then one of them spoke. "We follow you, Kazekage." The words were spoken with an unnatural evenness. There was no hesitation, no variance in tone, and they called him Kazekage? Like a guess more than an acknowledgement of his actual rank. Gaara's eyes narrowed. Too suspicious. Without waiting for a response, his sand shot forward, wrapping around his body harmlessly before smashing into the nearest guard. Surely, if they had thought to target him for any reason, they'd be ready for a fight. Surely he was not overreacting again. His hand struck the nearest guard, crashing him into the wall. The impact should have drawn breath, a groan of pain, something human. Instead, the body cracked. A splintering sound filled the corridor. Gaara's eyes widened. Forget human assassins. What he had just struck was not even that. It was a doll. The guard's head lolled to the side, his face splitting down the middle. Beneath the flesh-colored veneer, gears shifted, metal limbs clattered, and hollow sockets stared back at Gaara from within the broken shell. A puppet. There was only one puppeteer in the village, skilled enough to make a puppet that could pass as a human. Lady Chiyo. Had she seriously decided to turn on Gaara? Did something he do set her off? Gaara couldn't help but snarl at the betrayal as other guards moved in unison around him. Gaara, of course, reacted instantly, his sand lashing outward as the first wave of false shinobi lunged toward him. The corridor erupted into chaos. Controlled chaos. As Gaara's sand whipped through the air, striking down 2 more guards, their bodies splintering apart like brittle wood. Shards of painted flesh scattered across the stone floor, revealing the intricate mechanics beneath, craftsmanship even beyond anything Gaara had seen from Lady Chiyo. They were grotesquely lifelike, and more were coming. The hallway seemed to tighten, dark figures closing in. They did not falter. They did not hesitate. They did not breathe. How had his attacker wormed so many of these puppets into the core of the village without detection? Gaara blinked as the sand continued to crush the puppets. Sasori of the Red Sand was the most dangerous living shinobi to come out of Sunagakure. He was Lady Chiyo's grandson, known best for his complete mastery of puppets and poisons. Gaara regretted blaming Chiyo, if even just in his own head. Now that Sasori's name had come to mind, Gaara knew there could be no other. Of course it was him. But why had he returned to the village after claiming Gaara's father's life? Surely that was what they were after the first time. Killing Rasa to throw the village into upset turmoil? Gaara raised a hand, and the air trembled. His sand erupted outward, forming a jagged wall between him and the approaching puppets. It was painfully obvious now that his guards had been puppets. How could he have been so blind, so trusting? The puppets wordlessly threw themselves at his wall of sand in an attempt to pierce it. He looked around through nearby windows, wondering where Sasori could be hiding. An attack of this magnitude would surely require Sasori to be present, with at least eyes on the unfolding fight. Equally, Gaara had to curb the power of his attacks because they were still within the Kage building. This sandstone was tougher than the wooden structures of the Land of Fire. They would survive the damage, but they would also dampen the sound of such a battle. Not to mention how much preparation Sasori may have taken to keep the fighting under wraps. Surely, someone in the building would become wise to Gaara's fight. For now, though, Gaara fought alone. And that was exactly how Sasori had to have intended it. Beyond the confines of the dimly lit hallway, where sand and splintered wood clashed in chaotic bursts, Sunagakure remained eerily still. The battle raged in a vacuum, unheard and unnoticed. None of it was an accident. Sasori's puppets, those already integrated within Suna's forces, moved with calculated clarity, securing key positions around the Kage building. No one would interrupt this battle. No one would so much as realize it was happening. A shinobi stationed near the outer corridors furrowed his brow, straining to hear. He thought for a moment that he'd caught a tremor, something beyond the usual creaks of Sunagakure's aging infrastructure. The barest hint of a crash. Faint, muffled, too distant. His gut told him to check. He never got the chance. As he turned, something cold slid between his ribs. His breath caught, his body stiffened, and when he looked down, fingers slick with spreading warmth, he saw the glint of a thin, lacquered blade protruding from his chest. He collapsed without a sound, his killer catching him before his body could hit the floor. A puppet, indistinguishable from a real Suna shinobi, dragged him into the darkness before the blood could stain the sandstone. Another silent execution. Another missing piece in the chain of Sunagakure's defenses. Deeper within the building, a jonin had noticed something amiss. He paused mid-conversation, his trained senses tingling with an anomaly. A sound just on the edge of perception. Faint, almost imperceptible. He turned toward the disturbance. Another figure approached him from the side. Someone familiar, someone trusted. The jonin barely had time to react before the trusted figure's arm shot forward, a glimmering needle piercing his throat. He staggered, his hands shot up, instinctively grasping at the metal lodged in his neck. But there was no struggle, no sound. His vision blurred, his legs buckled, and then he too was gone. Sasori's control was absolute. With the perimeter secured, with every would-be interference eliminated, there was only one person left standing in his way. Gaara. The final steps of the illusion were in place. The village, as it had been for years, continued on without realizing it was already lost. The illusion of normalcy held. Gaara was winning. The puppets crumbled beneath his sand, their honed bodies snapping under the force of his strikes, joints shattered, limbs splintered, painted faces cracked into lifeless fragments as he crushed them one after another. And yet, for every one that fell, another took its place. It was wrong. Gaara had fought so many before. He had wiped out entire enemy squads alone, but this was so different. There was no hesitation, no fluctuation in their attacks. They did not retreat, they did not flinch, they did not die, and most concerningly, no one was coming. His ears strained as much as possible between attacks, expecting the sound of rushing footsteps, an alarm, something, but nothing came. No reinforcements, no frantic voices, just silence. Gaara's heartbeat quickened. He had no idea what innocents may remain in the building, so he couldn't just unleash the full brunt of his fighting force to quell these puppets. In as measured a step as possible, his sand lashed out in a violent wave, shredding through another line of puppets, smashing their bodies into the sandstone walls. The corridor began trembling under the force of these impacts, but the puppets didn't react. They didn't even try to dodge. So they weren't trying to win. No attempt. They were only stalling him, perhaps for Sasori's eventual arrival. His breath came faster, his sand curling tighter around him as his eyes flicked toward the exit at the end of the hall, the only way out, if he could just break through. But then, a whisper. Gaara's spine stiffened. The world flickered for just a second. A shadow shifted above him, one that he had not previously seen, movement so light and fleeting that it may as well have been a trick of the dim torchlight. Gaara reacted instantly, his hand surging upward, but too late. A sting. Something small, sharp, cold, pierced the flesh just above his collarbone, piercing straight through his sand armor. So small that it almost didn't register as pain, just an unfamiliar pressure. Gaara's sand lurched forward to retaliate, but his body faltered. His breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. He reached for his chakra, the force that not only answered him since childhood, but also one that he never had to consciously reach for. It was the bond he had never once doubted, and he found it slipping, sluggish, slow, like trying to grasp sand that wasn't his own. The needle. His fingers twitched toward the small puncture just above his collarbone, his vision sharpening, heart pounding, as realization struck. Poison. Not just any poison, but Sasori's poison. His was infamous for being the most deadly poison in the world. So what if Gaara could control sand with his fingertips? Such a poison was equally effective against an impoverished child as it was against the world's greatest warrior. Gaara gritted his teeth, pushing his chakra harder, but his body felt wrong, disconnected from itself. His sand shuddered, unstable. His grip over it was slipping. Slipping not because of pain or exhaustion, of both he had none. Instead, it was because something inside him was shutting down. He stumbled, not far, barely a shift in weight, but it was enough. The puppets around him stopped attacking. They no longer needed to. Gaara exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching, trying to force his sand to obey. He forced the gourd open, forced the grains to rise, and they did for a moment. And then they collapsed, the mass scattering like dry earth in the wind. The weight of it hit him harder than the poison itself. His sand would not come. His sand would not come. His chest rose and fell in measured breaths, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed the feeling clawing its way into his throat. Fear. Never in his life had he known true helplessness. He had never experienced an absence of his own power, but now it was failing him. His knees bent slightly, a momentary loss of strength, not an error, not a lapse in judgment, a result of the poison, and of the man who had crafted it. Gaara's breath slowed. His legs, once steady as the stone beneath him, bent further. The weight in his limbs dragged him downward with a deep attack that he just could not resist. The poison was winning. His sand lay in motionless heaps around him, an inert mass of golden grains that no longer felt like an extension of himself.
"Free me, you fool, before it's too late!"
Shukaku attempted to hammer from within, but it was too late. Gaara had already lost the faculties to pull the plug and release Shukaku. His seal kept Shukaku securely locked away. There was nothing the beast could do to prevent its own demise, alongside Gaara's. If Gaara did not release it, they would both die together. Gaara's fingers curled weakly, as if trying to gather it, as if expecting it to rise again. It did not. The corridor felt colder, his vision blurred at the edges, the dim torchlight flickering too weakly as if he were seeing it through thickened glass. Gaara tried to force himself upright, to resist the pull dragging him down, but his body ignored him. His knees hit the stone floor, and in that moment, as his body betrayed him entirely as his vision swayed, he caught sight of something beyond the corridor's archway. The village. Sunagakure stretched beyond the open space, the same as it had always been. The streets glowed gold beneath the dying sun, bustling with life. Dying sun? Had the poison messed with his interpretation of time, too? The people continued their day. Vendors calling, children weaving between stalls, shinobi moving along the rooftops. Nothing had changed. The world had not shifted. The sky had not darkened. No one screamed. No one ran. No one looked toward the Kage building in alarm. They didn't know. They didn't know. Gaara's fingers pressed against the ground. He tried to move, tried to reach for something, anything, but his body was no longer his own. The village remained untouched, and he was being taken away from it. Gaara's body slumped forward, his weight caught before he could fully collapse. A hand gripped his shoulder, not a warm one, not a human one, cold, enameled, smooth. Puppet fingers curled around his frame, lifting him with the ease of a marionette on strings. Now his head lolled, the world tilting as the sky and village blurred together in his hazy vision. He barely felt his feet leave the ground. A whisper of shifting silk. Sasori stepped forward. The master puppeteer and poisoner observed his work without satisfaction, without amusement, only the stillness of a craftsman admiring the completion of a delicate, inevitable process. Like a spider curling its prey in webbing, Gaara was his. Without a sound, the remaining puppets shuffled away, returning to their stations. The lifeless guards resumed their patrols, stationed themselves at their posts, their movements flawless in their imitation of the humans they had replaced. Not a soul had been alerted and survived. The Kage building, its halls still occupied by clueless officials wrapped in political quarrels, remains untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded within it. Sasori's puppets filing into position around the officials and returning to a patrol around the village. And indeed, outside, the village carried on. Merchants haggled over price, shinobi monitored the gates, children kicked balls into their neighbors' windows, all unaware that their strongest warrior was gone. Sasori stepped into the shadows, his prize in tow, as if nothing had happened at all. The illusion of normalcy held. And that's the end of today's episode. I know the role players in my Discord might be a little disappointed that this isn't really an arc fully fixated on the chunin exams, but will still return from time to time for a status report. In fact, other than this Konohamaru versus Hanabi fight, I had a bit of an idea. What if the role players in my Discord decide the outcome of the matches based on the weaving of their little narration? I already know who I'm promoting and who I'm not. So maybe if, past this first fight, there's enough roleplay engagement, I can get some of you helping to decide how these fights play out. It's just an experiment that may land flat on its face, but I thought I'd run it by everyone. I can do all the work myself, no problem. However, after all, I've only made this rewrite as in-depth as I have because of all you fine folk. Might as well get some direct input on the fates of some of these matches. But Polly, why are you talking about that right now? Did you really just do Gaara dirty like that? Oh, right. Yeah, I did. Only what was necessary, of course. Nah, I always saw this as a what-if scenario in canon. If Sasori had made the move and not Deidara, how would that have played out? I feel like Sasori would have taken his time. He would have planted puppets in the place of every ninja he assassinated. He would have monitored the exact patrol routes of every person he meant to assassinate. It would be methodical, slow, measured, logical, and definitely in keeping with the more ninja-like approach. That his puppets would literally keep the appearance of normalcy so well that Sasori could slip in and out without any detection. He would have known characters like Yura as mind puppets under his control, as well as lifelike puppets keeping up appearances. But does this mean the Akatsuki are moving? And don't they operate in pairs? Where's Sasori's partner? Who's his partner? Deidara was with Zetsu after all. Ah yes, this new development is very yummy for me. I tried to provide hints before the puppet reveal that there were already puppets littered throughout the village and Kage building, so hopefully some of you caught that. And yeah, apparently writer's block is gone. I had absolutely zero trouble writing this in, and this is just the start of the set. Also, Asuma finally showed up after returning to the village. I know you might think that Konohamaru would be aware of his arrival, but according to the timeline, Konohamaru has been deeply embroiled in chunin exam nonsense that whole time. Not to mention, Asuma was doing a lot of business within the clan to earn forgiveness. We'll see a bit more of this later. While everyone's happy that he's returned, he still abandoned them to begin with. This is the kind of thing that he needed to address first and foremost. Let's end this baby and look forward to what help may be sent for Gaara, if they even realize he's missing. The sky's the limit!